And something I've perceived in it's not just Lutheran circles, but in kind of conservative Christian young men's circles is that what they're looking for is the validation of the in-group people, and oftentimes the validation of higher status males within that group.
Mm.
And the problem with that becomes that when validation comes from saying the things that you're not supposed to say according to the kind of squishy liberal mindset, there's a switch that can take place. So, all right. So in other words, like I think a good example of this would be like in how we talk about like this kind of weird spot we find ourselves in with the issue of how people view the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to kind of try to avoid using the term anti-Semitism because I don't think it's a terribly helpful term, but like just broadly speaking, Jew hatred.
Mm-hmm.
And so you look at, so you see this rising on both kind of the left and the right. And on the left, it's pretty easy to understand, which is they're communists and they think in terms of oppressors and oppressed. And so if you look at like the Israel-Palestine conflict, they go, well, Israel has power, so therefore they're the oppressors, which means they're bad,
mm-hmm.
which is a very sort of shallow, juvenile way of looking at things. It's a very the division between Israelis and Palestinians is obviously a horrifically complex issue. But the idea that like, oh, well, just the people that have more power are the bad guys. Well, or it could be that the bad guys are lunatics, and the reason they don't have power is because lunatics aren't good at like running governments
mm-hmm. Yep.
and establishing civilization and things of that nature. You know, so but it's easy to see how the left gets there. For the right, there's I think there's this sense of there are a whole bunch of things that you're not allowed to say, even though they're true and they're
mm-hmm.
objectively true, right? So you're not allowed to say, for example, that Black Americans commit a disproportionate amount of crimes,
mm-hmm.
even though it's true.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to make any value judgment on it whatsoever, and you can add in 8 trillion other factors that would sort of explain things in a way that doesn't that doesn't pour out condemnation upon people for the color of their skin.
You're not allowed to say this,
but you're just not allowed to. You're not allowed to say the statistic.
Mm-hmm.
It's ironic that it's impossible to say the statistic, right? So this group will look at stuff and they'll like you can look at the Black Lives Matter thing and it'll go back to that that summer of 2020 and. Where people are I remember seeing a video of some guy interviewing Black women on the streets in St. Paul, in the area, St. Paul area, where there are a lot of riots going on. And they were saying, they said, the guy interviewing them said, how many unarmed Black men do you think police kill every year? And they said, it's thousands. And the real answer is it's like 15.
Mm-hmm.
So just, so you can assert things that are totally, completely false.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine because it disparages white folks, right? And creates this demon of evil white police officers. But yeah, you couldn't say things like you're way more likely if you're a white man, you're way more likely to be a victim, or white person, you're way more likely to experience violence at the hands of a Black man than a Black man is from the hands of white people.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't say things like that. And then if you look at, for example, like the Jewish issue, there are things that you can't say because they're supposedly anti-Semitic, even though they're inarguably true. So like if someone says the Jews run Hollywood, I recognize that there's a way you can say the Jews, which reveals that you hate them,
mm-hmm.
right? But saying the majority of Hollywood studios have been run by Jewish people throughout history is inarguably true.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like you look at and it also makes total sense because Jews invented Hollywood. Like
mm-hmm.
they started motion picture companies,
mm-hmm.
back in the day. So again, you don't even have to assess a negative moral judgment to it. You're just not even allowed to say it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what happens with zealous young guys is they perceive you're not allowed to say things that are true because this group over here says that that's offensive and hateful and racist. So you're not allowed to say the things that are true. And then there's a kind of a brain rot switch that's flipped where you then come to the conclusion, the more I'm not allowed to say it, the more true it must be. So in other words, if I'll get in some trouble for saying Jews run Hollywood, and then if I say the Holocaust didn't happen and I get in way more trouble for that, then I must be getting in trouble because it's true. So that's the kind of switch I think that happens with a lot of these young guys.
So because one thing that I can't say is true, all the other things I'm not allowed to say are probably also true.
And the more unutterable they are, the truer they must be. So, and then what happens is that you get into these sort of validation circles where you have guys.
To clarify what you're saying, you're pushing back against that.
Right, you're pushing back against that.
You are pushing back against that.
I'm personally pushing back against that.
You're pushing back against that. That is a problem when people take and they say, okay, because I'm not allowed to say this, it's true.
Right.
Therefore, these other things I'm not allowed to say must be true.
Right.
You're
saying that that's where everything falls apart.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it's no longer about evidence and facts and understanding. It's about I say a thing that I'm not supposed to say, and the negative reaction is actually the evidence that it's true, as opposed to like the evidence is the thing that makes it true. So that's what I'm criticizing there. And I think what happens with young guys on top of that is that then you get these kind of affirmation circles where you find a bunch of online friends and you all kind of you're on the same page with this. And then the more willing you are to say something that's unutterable, the more committed to the cause you are, which kind of spirals things. And which is, I think, where you then get into this kind of like weird realm of conspiracy theories. There's a guy I know, I don't know him personally, but and then through some other friends and on a text thread a while ago was espousing this idea that the Jews did 9/11. And that there were it's this conspiracy theory about how there were secret coded messages in the walkways going to the Twin Towers that only Jews would have understood, because they went to all of the Jew meetings. They went to all of the secret code Jew meetings. That were telling them don't go to the Twin Towers because, bad stuff's going to happen today. And I said, well, what benefit would the Jews have from doing 9/11? And the answer was so that the United States would get involved in the Mideast and destabilize Middle Eastern countries, which would make Israel stronger. And where that kind of falls apart to me is we've been doing that nonstop already for decades. And the United States government does not need extra motivation. They don't need secret terrorist motivation to mess around in countries where everything's going to fall apart. So, but you could just tell that's what it was. Is like I'm more committed to the truth the more insane of a thing I'm willing to say about this group.